Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Rupert, for inviting me. I really feel proud. I'm not quite sure whether I'm back in class or whether I'm being knighted, but anyway, it's a real good occasion to air some views. I'm not quite sure whether it's going to be hard for you to listen or not. But what I will do actually is challenge one or two points that have just been made by Laura, so there is, I suppose, scope for discussion. I'm not using any PowerPoint. This is sheer 20th century, the way I'm going to present this, but for reasons which I think will become clear as I speak. It is certainly a truism that we are living through a historical period of exceptional and substantial societal change. Let me just remind us of 10 indicators out of many. The revolution in communication, the supposed takeover by artificial powers beyond our control, the surging worldwide interdependence of the human race, the fact that our planet might become uninhabitable, the crisis of parliamentary Western-style democracy, the demise of the national state, the hubris of capitalism, the resurrection of the individual, not least in a gender context, the reintroduction of religion into the public discourse, and finally, the power struggle with civil society. These and a range of other indicators are not, of course, coherent with each other. Rather, they represent a mounting uncertainty about all our traditions of living, learning, and governing. Our social order, the very fabric of our society, is crumbling. Do we need disruptive innovation on a scale not known for many centuries? The President of the United States may be seen as having adopted this principle if his actions can be pinned to any underlying principle at all. Or do we have to resist any of this happening, as the majority of the British people and increasingly substantial minorities in France, Germany, Italy, and many other European countries seem to believe? As democracy, or at least the type we've developed for the past 300 years or so, had its day, as developments in China and elsewhere seem to suggest? Or is it the combined, overbearing power of state bureaucracies and multinational corporations at the bottom of it all, and in urgent need of replacement by a participative, citizen-orientated system? Do we need to stop exaggerated individualism, or should we concentrate on enhancing the power of the individual against menacing collectivities? Must we do all we can to make supra, trans, and international governance structures work, or should we rather strip them of the power they have acquired over the past 2 generations? One thing is certain, most of us would be at a loss to say what merits saving and what has to undergo change so substantial that we cannot even imagine the outcome. There is no master plan, no roadmap that we might agree upon. We are muddling through on a scale never before known. We are cherishing, or at least pretending to cherish, principles of old, while not really believing in them. We are not facing the real issues and resorting to mistrust and control mechanisms, although we should be aware that if we look at history, it is quite clear that you cannot build a society based on mistrust, and that more controls precede going under. This is indeed a gloomy picture. We seem to know so much, but we fail to put it into societal perspective. We do not know how to get our act together. Our governors firmly believe technical innovation will solve our problems and refuse to recognize the need for societal change. Think tanks abound. I come from one of them, which in itself is a clear indicator that something must be wrong or going wrong. And yet, while some of them aspire to tell us what to do, none seem to come up with the solution. And what is more, politics have become too serious a business to allow us to leave them to politicians, let alone to government officials. So, what about civil society and philanthropy? Can they achieve what the public and the private sector do not seem to be achieving? Are they destined to be change agents? I can and will not even start to answer any of these questions I have thrown up. Doing so has rather set the scene for 3 points I wish to make. 1, the interplay between civil society and other societal arenas. 2, the need to adopt a standardized definition of civil society. And 3, the need to discuss some normative issues. My first point is that the scenario I have sketched out, while possibly giving civil society and philanthropy a role to fill, does not imply that civil society and philanthropy will necessarily fill it. Some prerequisites and conditions will have to be met if civil society is to have any chance of succeeding. Also, I am certainly not asserting that civil society will have to take over from government and business. Amitai Etzioni, one of the forefathers of civil society research, wrote in 1973, and I quote, "Actually, this third sector may well be the most important alternative for the next few decades, not by replacing the other two, but by matching and balancing their important roles." End of quote. I firmly believe in the theory that 3 distinct arenas, the state, the private or business sector, and civil society, circle around the individual and his immediate relationships, which take center place. Society centers around man, not as the 20th century would have us believe the other way around. Each of these arenas is a necessary component of 21st century society, and each is dependent on the others in order to perform its duties. The failure to recognize and accept civil society as one of these arenas is one of the reasons why the state and the market are failing, while it is not, as has been suggested, this failure alone that has generated the emergence of the notion of civil society. Civil society has existed in one form or another at least since the time of the Great Transformation, the Axial Age, first described by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers in 1949, to mean a period between the 8th and the 2nd century BC, when a worldwide, near-simultaneous transformation of thought and subsequently of society took place. However, over the last 2 generations or so, a novel concept of civil society has emerged that differs from previous concepts, including the one put forward by Adam Ferguson in 1767. It may be seen today as a coherent group of collective movements and organizations which are in many ways hugely diverse, but do bear some common traits that allow us to distinguish them from organizations and institutions that form part of the state or the private business sector. If, contrary to Margaret Thatcher's famous quip, society is something that exists and is not synonymous with the state or the nation, relevant collective action takes place in each of these 3 arenas. I prefer the term arena to them being described as pillars, as it makes us realize that we are talking about areas of movement, action, and change. Although we are well aware of these common traits, both academia and public opinion, and not least the agents of civil society in the field, have continued to engage in a discussion over definition, and we've just heard a little bit about that. This is decidedly, in my view, unfortunate, as it renders it more difficult to make a conclusive case for civil society as an arena, and most particularly for the involvement of this arena in discussions over societal development and change. Even the pioneering work undertaken by Lester Salomon and his many associates since the 1990s in mapping the empirical evidence in a comparative fashion worldwide, while teaching us a lot about the sheer size of civil society, has not achieved one of its main purposes, that is to present a standardized and universally accepted notion of what civil society is and who is part of it. Therefore, my second point is that we need to outline what such a standard definition of civil society might look like and adopt, stick to, and market it. As long as we confuse the world
by a never-ending discussion on definition we cannot expect to be taken seriously. So, what are the defining features of civil society? Civil society may be described as the citizens' arena, the place where citizens engage by their own free will, participate directly in affairs to do with the common good, and voice their concerns, ideas, criticism, and agreement. Lester Salomon's Johns Hopkins Comparative Nonprofit Sector Project defined a number of principles that may decide whether an activity, a movement, an organization, an institution should be considered part of this particular arena. Access should be voluntary. The organization should not be engaged in core government business. Making a profit should not be a prime objective. The governance structure should be autonomous, and any profits may not be distributed to members or owners. Though civil society organizations, CSOs, command a considerable full-time and part-time workforce, the arena as such is based and relies heavily on volunteerism, which is where philanthropy comes in. Philanthropy, in the true sense of the word, is not just what donors of funds are doing, let alone what foundations do. Philanthropy is the spirit in which gifts of empathy, time, ideas, know-how, reputation, and financial resources are put at the disposal either of individuals in need or of organizations deemed able to use these gifts to perform their self-allotted tasks. The first mention of philanthropy in philosophical literature, as probably most of you know, is in Plato, who in one of his dialogues let Socrates call himself a philanthropist because he lets others partake of his wisdom free of charge. In 1960, the French political economist François Pérou described giving as the attribute of what we call civil society, while force is attributed to the state and exchanges are associated with the market. Though philanthropic giving is by no means the prime source of civil society funding, it is most certainly a major driving force in empowering its agents. Empowered in this way, as Albert Hirschman rightly established in 1970, civil society organizations may engage in tasks that support existing societal systems, loyal, may distance themselves from mainstream society, exit, or become an opposing force, voice. Under all three of these headings, we may see 8 distinct role models. Many organizations are active in more than one: service provision, advocacy, watchdog, intermediary, self-help, community building, political discourse, and self-fulfillment. These role models have developed over the past 30 years or so, both in practice and in theory. But since the American economist Richard Cornuelle first spoke of an independent sector beyond the state and the market in 1965, the discussion about the overall function of this sector or arena has never stopped. He argued that associations of volunteers could effectively solve social problems without recourse to heavy-handed bureaucracy, while governments in particular would prefer to see these associations and foundations support the government's work in a subservient fashion and neither question government decisions nor adopt any degree of independence. Little wonder that service-providing and intermediary organizations are popular with governments, while the self-help, self-fulfillment and community-building roles are habitually overlooked, and advocacy, watchdog, and political discourse roles are viewed with suspicion. Responding to pressure from the citizens, advocacy has found its way into tax exemption, and the watchdog role has gained acceptance for watching over excess market behavior. But Colin Crouch's insistence that given the Parliament's failure in fulfilling that role, civil society's main task is to act as watchdog in public affairs has not to date made government theorists and practitioners rethink the interplay between various contributors to the development and execution of policy. On the contrary, the public sector and somewhat strangely the media tend to belittle the role of civil society and use arguments to do with the rank of representative democracy to enhance their own role, while at the same time accepting the private sector, in other words business, as a driving and quite regularly decisive force in determining policy. The most obnoxious civil society role model in the eyes of those caught up in the present system of government is civil society's demand to be heard as a contributor to public discourse, with one notable exception. In countries, the government of which are seen as undemocratic in the sense that they have not taken on and or said goodbye to principles Western democracies uphold, civil society that opposes the government is hailed as the expression of the people's will. We have seen this happen in the past, not least in the Central and Eastern Europe transformation process in the late 1980s. But, to put it very bluntly, civil rights fighters in China are considered heroes, while civil rights protests in Hamburg at a G20 conference are seen as a criminal disruption of public order. And civil liberties activists in Catalonia are quickly labeled as terrorists. This means we not only have a problem of defining civil society itself, but also of defining its activities. A fairly academic debate when it comes to deciding whether a hospital managed by a not-for-profit organization is part of civil society or not. I would contend it is. But a very real issue when we are talking about terrorism, civil liberties, and indeed societal change. This brings me to my third point and back to the question whether and how civil society may act as a change agent. We must recognize that the resources in volunteer work and donations that civil society can command are nothing compared to what governments obtain from the citizens by way of taxes and what the business community makes by selling goods and services. In this respect, civil society is the smallest of the three arenas, and this will not change in the foreseeable future. So what is it that civil society brings to the table? There have been instances where the growth in coherence, power and strength that civil society has gone through over the past generation or two, its ability to post societal needs and drive the issues have been decisive. Care for the environment, gender issues, individual liberties, and indeed the fall of the Berlin Wall and the whole process of transition in 1989, 1990 were driven by civil society action, by determined activists and philanthropists. And we may be certain that this kind of thing will happen again. The heterogeneous, hierarchical, and more often than not plainly chaotic structure of a CSO is quite obviously better suited to become a hotbed of new ideas and creative and potentially disruptive innovation than an orderly government agency and or corporation. The way many business startups operate is proof of this rather sweeping statement. They are imitating civil society procedures. But this does not answer our question. Neither can the fact that the concept of civil society in its modern sense has by now developed over 2 generations or more, and I've deliberately used some older sources here, and that there is every reason to believe that civil society is here to stay, suffice. Nor will success alone make civil society action legitimate. I would argue that both the impact and the legitimacy of civil society rest on a normative theory. Civil society is by no means inherently good. Just as there are good and bad governments and honest traders and crooks in business, there exist, of course, CSOs we do not approve of, be this in a fundamental sense or simply because they have different views than ours. The Ku Klux Klan, the National Rifle Association of America, and to name a German example, Pegida, are examples of the first, while a plethora of associations and foundations whose goals do not correspond to mine or yours may be among the second. Normative principles are needed to decide whether or not an organization may be considered good, i.e. acceptable to society. Among them, one may determine some very general ones, such as a basic belief in the human being as the supreme principle of society, respect for other human beings, their distinct and possibly very different ways of life and convictions, adherence to basic societal principles such as human and civil rights, the rule of law, and government by the people for the people, and a belief in a pluralist society that allows for each and every individual to lead the life she or he wishes, provided this does not infringe on the life of others. Furthermore, there are some that are specific to civil society, like a strict priority for ideals and ideas rather than for personal material gains, a commitment to be accountable to the citizenry at large, an acknowledgement of everyone's right to assemble and associate, and an endorsement of a political role for civil society. All this will not allow us to disregard or disqualify organizations, the views or goals of which we do not like. On the contrary, our respect for others will oblige us to listen most carefully to opposing statements and to consider positions we do not embrace. Furthermore, this respect will make us exercise caution and restraint when it comes to playing the power game. Large foundations and other CSOs face a particular challenge here. But in doing so, they will join an ever-growing number of smaller, very often minute CSOs and become what in other arenas is proving to be virtually impossible, change agents. Change agents are not legitimized by size or by election procedures. They are legitimate by the quality of their proposals. A fairly novel and increasingly important and attractive subsector of civil society has proven to be particularly suited for this task. It is what we call informal civil society, movements without much of or even any structure that convene around one point, one thought, one philanthropic impulse. During the refugee wave that hit Germany in 2015, it was individuals who assembled their friends, small groups of volunteers called up over social media, responsible citizens who in the light of a failing government bureaucracy lived up to Chancellor Merkel's famous "Wir schaffen das," we can do this. It was they that enabled Germany to cope with 1 million refugees in less than 6 months. It is they that will most probably be the most influential change agents. To see these principles gain general and possibly universal acceptance is by its very nature an unorganized and unorganizable process. Therefore, in conclusion, I would say that in this country, the past 3 years have seen more recognition of the role of civil society and a more serious and to-the-point debate on the role of philanthropy than ever before. This is one reason why, although we fully realize what is happening in countries like Hungary, Turkey, Egypt, Russia, China, and others, my colleagues and I prefer talking about the changing rather than the shrinking space for civil society. Yet, issues of legitimacy and relevance are still being discussed by professional politicians who continue to cherish the notion that they are in the driver's seats, by mainstream academia that still lets a conference like the one we are attending seem an exception rather than an adequate response to what is really happening in society, by the media who still prefer to report on the occasional scandal or on local events rather than offering civil society full participation in the debate on public affairs. If, however, we can consistently demonstrate that the goals we would wish to see reached will in fact only be reached by adopting principles that civil society embraces, it will be clear that, as Perukana put it, the .gov, .com and .org worlds will interact on a level playing field. Thank you for your patience.